Arthur's family truth. I was almost out the door when he grabbed my arm. Not rough, not threatening, just a firm hand on my forearm. And when I turned around, he was already leaning in close enough that I could see the VFW pins on his cap. "Don't give your son the key to your outbuilding," he said. Low voice, steady, like he was telling me the weather. Then he let go, nodded once and walked out through the sliding doors. I stood there in the vitamin aisle of a Walgreens on a Tuesday afternoon holding a bottle of fish oil, and I had no idea what had just happened. My name is Earl Delano. I'm 64, retired electrician, and I live on 3 acres outside of town in the house my wife Helen and I shared for 31 years. Helen passed 18 months ago, lung cancer. She never smoked a day in her life, and I'll never stop thinking that's unfair. That Tuesday I'd stopped at Walgreens on the way back from my cardiologist. Routine visit, blood pressure running a little high. Dr. Okafor wanted to tweak my dosage. Nothing serious. I only needed one thing. The fish oil Helen used to pick up for me every month without me ever asking. 2 years of buying it myself now, and it still feels like something I'm forgetting. The store was quiet. Maybe 4 in the afternoon, I was the only customer in the back half of the place. There was a man ahead of me at the pharmacy counter. Tall, maybe 68 or so, canvas jacket, VFW cap with a row of pins on the brim. His shoulders had that particular curve you see in men who've spent decades carrying weight, not physical weight, the other kind. I wasn't trying to listen. The store was just that quiet. "Sir, your secondary insurance isn't showing active in our system." The pharmacist was young patient. "Without it, the Eliquis comes to $147. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet. Old leather, the kind you don't replace because it feels wrong to. He opened it. Even from where I stood, I could see there wasn't much inside. "I've got about 60 on me," he said. "No drama, no performance, just a man stating a fact." "Eliquis is a blood thinner," the pharmacist said carefully. "If you've been on it a while, skipping doses." "I know what it is," he said. I stepped up and put my debit card on the counter before I'd fully thought it through. Helen always said that about me. "You act before you reason, Earl." She didn't mean it as a criticism. "Put it on this," I said. The man turned and looked at me. Deep-set eyes, a face that had seen a lot of years. He didn't jump to protest, which I respected. A lot of people would have. He just looked at me, sizing things up. "I don't take charity," he said. "It's not charity." My father-in-law was on Eliquis for 9 years. "I know what happens if you miss doses. Call it one neighbor helping another." He looked at me for another moment, then gave a small, clean nod, the kind that means a man has decided to accept something without making a scene out of it. The pharmacist ran my card. $147, fine by me. He took his bag, turned to face me, and put out his hand. "Roy Cathcart, Earl Delano." "You live around here, Earl?" "Out past the county line," I said. "Old place." "Been in the family 40 years. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away. And then something shifted in his expression. Not big, just a small change. A man who's decided something. He glanced toward the front windows of the store, then back at me. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, and his voice dropped. "And I need you to not ask me how I know it." "Can you do that?" He wasn't the type who said strange things for effect. You can usually tell. "All right," I said. "Your son is going to come by this weekend. Flat." Calm, like he was reading from something. "When he does, don't give him the key to your outbuilding," and then he walked out. I drove home on Route 9 trying to find a reasonable explanation. I couldn't find one. He was a complete stranger. I had never seen that man in my life, and he had just told me specifically about my son, about the shed. To understand why that landed the way it did, you need to know a few things about both. The shed I built myself. The summer Gary turned 14. He was supposed to help, and he showed up for about half a Saturday before deciding he had somewhere better to be. That was Gary even then, always somewhere else, always chasing something just out of reach. I finished the 10 by 14 pine structure by myself. One window on the east wall that catches the morning light. Helen kept her gardening things in there. I kept my tools. But over the years it became something more than that. After Gary moved out and stopped calling except when he needed something. After Helen got sick and then got better and then got sick again and didn't get better. After I spent 2 years learning how to remember all the small things she used to handle without ever making a fuss about it, the shed became a kind of vault. There's a fireproof safe bolted to the concrete floor in the back corner. Inside it, the original deed to the property, Helen's wedding ring, she made me put it somewhere safe near the end, when her fingers had gotten too thin to wear it, and $6,200 in cash. Not a fortune, just what I'd been setting aside quietly for years, a little at a time, the way men my generation do because we don't entirely trust what we can't put our hands on. Gary knew the shed existed. I had no reason to believe he knew about the safe. Here's what I knew about Gary as of that Tuesday in November. He was 37 years old. He lived 45 minutes away in the city in an apartment he'd shared for the past 2 years with a woman named Donna, who I had met exactly once at a birthday dinner and who seemed pleasant enough but kept checking her phone under the table. He worked in insurance sales, or had been, the last time we talked about it in any real way. Back in September, he mentioned his numbers were down and the company was restructuring. He said things were tight. Then he asked me, not for the first time, whether I'd ever thought about selling the property. "Dad, you're out here alone on 3 acres. You're 64. That house is worth real money now. You could be comfortable somewhere easier." I told him I was already comfortable. "You could travel," he said. I told him Helen and I had never been big travelers, and she was the one I would have wanted to travel with anyway. He went quiet after that. The conversation ended the way most of our conversations end, not in a fight, just in that particular kind of silence that means nothing got resolved and both of us knew it. That was September. We hadn't talked much since. I want to be straight about something, because I think it matters. Gary wasn't always like this. There was a version of him, a kid who used to fall asleep against my arm on long car rides, who once spent an entire Saturday helping me rewire the garage when he was 12, hands too small for the connectors but too stubborn to quit. Helen used to say he had my temperament and her restlessness, which was probably the wrong combination. I don't know when things shifted. These things rarely have a clean starting point. What I know is that by the time he was in his late 20s, the calls had gotten shorter and farther apart, and most of them eventually circled back to money in one way or another. I didn't know about the gambling until later. I'll get to that. Thursday, 2 days after Walgreens. My phone rang, and I saw Gary's name on the screen, and I already knew from the first word what kind of call it was going to be. "Hey, Dad." That specific tone, warm in a way that has an agenda behind it. I'd been hearing that tone for 30 years. He said he was thinking of coming by Saturday. Help out before winter set in. He mentioned the gutters on the back of the garage needed attention. I hadn't said a word to him about any gutters. Not in months. But I said that sounded fine. He said he'd bring his buddy Floyd. Floyd had a contractor's license and drove a work truck with tools in the back that were always cleaner than they should be for someone who supposedly used them every day. "Sure," I said. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet, the way it's been quiet for 18 months, a specific kind of quiet that has a shape to it. I looked out the window at the shed. The padlock on the door was one I'd had for 15 years. An old master lock, reliable enough, nothing special. The key hung on a hook by the back door, right where it always hung. Right where anyone who'd spent any time in my kitchen would know to look. I thought about Roy Cathcart and his steady eyes and the way he'd said it. "Don't give him the key to your outbuilding." Not a question, not a suggestion, a warning. Friday morning, I drove into town. I bought a new padlock, heavy-duty, hardened shackle. The man at the hardware store said you'd need an angle grinder to get through it. I paid cash, drove home, and put it on the shed that same afternoon. The old lock went into my jacket pocket. The new key went on my actual key ring, the one I keep in my pants. Not on the hook by the door. Not anywhere visible. Then I went inside and tried to figure out what I actually believed was happening. The honest answer is that part of me still wanted a different explanation. Any father would. There's a part of you that keeps looking for the version of events where your kid isn't the one you're locking the door against. I sat with that part of me most of Friday evening. I didn't sleep well that night. Mostly I lay in the dark listening to the house settle, and the wind come down off the ridge, running the same loop of thoughts over and over. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard a vehicle on the road. Our driveway is about 110 feet of gravel from the county road to the house. The gravel makes a sound when someone pulls in. This sound didn't come up the driveway, it stopped at the end of it, out on the road itself, and just sat there. No lights, I could make out the shape from the bedroom window, but not the make or the plates. I watched the clock on the nightstand. 4 minutes. Maybe 5. Then it moved on. I went back to bed and lay there until the sky started getting light. By the time I made coffee, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to confront Gary. I wasn't going to call him and demand answers. I was going to watch, and I was going to wait, and I was going to let Saturday play out exactly as planned. If I was wrong about all of this, no harm done, and if I wasn't wrong, I needed to see it for myself. Gary showed up at 10 Saturday morning in his gray Audi, the kind of car that always looks too clean for county roads. Floyd pulled in right behind him in a work truck. I watched them from the kitchen window before I went to the door. I made coffee. We sat at the table and talked about nothing for about 20 minutes. The weather, the price of heating oil, a game from the week before that none of us had actually watched. Gary was relaxed, easy. The version of him that shows up when he wants something attentive, a little funnier than usual, asking follow-up questions like he's genuinely interested. Floyd was quieter, big guy, mid-40s, the kind of handshake that's trying too hard. He had grease on his boots, but his hands were clean. After a while, Gary mentioned the gutters. I put my jacket on and we walked around to the back of the garage. The three of us stood there looking up at a section of gutter that had absolutely nothing wrong with it, and we discussed it like it was a serious problem for about 10 minutes. Gary pointed at the bracket. Floyd nodded. I nodded. Nobody said anything that meant anything. Floyd said he was going to grab his ladder from the truck. Gary said he'd help carry it. I said I needed to use the bathroom, and I went inside. I didn't go to the bathroom. I went to the kitchen window, the one over the sink that looks out toward the back of the property, and I stood to the side of it where the light wouldn't give me away, and I watched. They didn't go to the truck. They walked straight to the shed. I watched Gary try the door handle first, just a quick pull. The way you do when you're hoping something isn't locked. It was locked. He saw the new padlock. He stood there looking at it for a moment, then looked at Floyd. Floyd crouched down and examined it up close, turned it over, looked at the shackle, ran his thumb along the body of it. He said something to Gary. Gary straightened up, put both hands on his hips, and looked toward the house. I stepped back from the window before he could see me. I went to the front room and sat in my chair and waited. About a minute later, they came in through the back door. Floyd said he'd had a look at the gutter, and it wasn't too bad. Probably just needed a screw tightened at the bracket. Gary agreed. I said that was good to know. We had more coffee. Then Gary asked, casual as anything, whether I'd put a different lock on the shed. Said he noticed it when he walked by. Replace the old one, I said. It was corroding. Ah, he nodded, both hands wrapped around his mug. Where do you keep the key for the new one? I looked at him. He looked back at me. Whatever was going on behind his eyes, he kept it carefully arranged. On my key ring, I said. He nodded again like that was the most natural answer in the world. We finished the coffee. They left before noon. I stood on the porch and watched the Audi go down the driveway and turn onto the county road. What I felt wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was heavier than that. The kind of feeling you get when you've been hoping you were wrong about something and then you find out you weren't. Sunday afternoon, I went out to the shed. I opened the new padlock and stepped inside. The east window was letting in the last of the afternoon light, that low gray November kind. I stood there and looked at the floor. The concrete in that shed I laid myself. I know every crack, every variation in the surface. In front of the safe, there were scratches I hadn't put there. Thin parallel lines in the concrete, the kind a pry bar makes when someone works it under the base of something heavy, trying to get leverage. They hadn't gotten anywhere. The safe is bolted through the floor with hardware I spec'd myself. But they had tried, and they hadn't tried on Saturday. The new padlock had stopped them Saturday. These marks were older. The edges had the dull look of concrete dust that had already settled. I stood there thinking about all the days in the past month I'd been away from the house, the grocery store, my cardiology appointment, the 2 hours I spent at the county extension office looking into a drainage issue on the back of the property. Any one of those days. The old padlock was still in my jacket pocket. I took it out and held it up to the light from the east window. I'd thought the wear around the keyhole was just age 15 years, hard winters, the kind of weathering you expect, but now I looked at it more carefully. The scratches around the keyhole had a pattern to them. Fine, parallel, deliberate. The kind of marks a bump key leaves. Someone had been inside my shed. Not on Saturday, but before. With a copied key or a bump key on a day I wasn't home. And they had spent enough time in here to get down on their knees in front of that safe and try to work it open. Helen's ring was in that safe. The deed to this property was in that safe. I put the lock in my pocket and went back inside. I didn't call Gary. I didn't drive over to his apartment. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and then I picked up the phone and called Brian. Brian is my older son. He's 41, lives in Ohio, works in logistics. He's the steady one, the one who calls on Sunday afternoons without needing a reason, who flew out when Helen was in the hospital without me having to ask twice. He listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Dad, don't confront him. Go to the sheriff's office first thing Monday. Take the lock with you." That was the right call. I knew it before he said it. Monday morning, I drove to the county sheriff's office. The deputy I spoke with was a woman named Norma Reyes. She was thorough and didn't make me feel foolish for any of it, which meant more than she probably realized. I brought the old padlock in a zip bag, photos I'd taken of the scratch marks on the concrete, and a written account of everything: the Walgreens conversation, the phone call Thursday, what I watched through the kitchen window on Saturday, what I found in the shed on Sunday. She took all of it, asked good questions, wrote things down the old-fashioned way, pen on a notepad. Before I left, she said, "Mr. Delano, if any of this connects the way you think it does, you did the right thing coming here first." I drove home and waited. 2 weeks later, she called me back. What she'd found was more than I expected, and less of a surprise than it probably should have been. My neighbor Dale, 2 properties down, had installed a security camera on the side of his barn last spring after some tools went missing. His camera angle covers a stretch of the county road, including the shoulder in front of my driveway. On the afternoon of my cardiology appointment, a date I had never mentioned to Gary, the footage showed a gray Audi pulling onto the gravel shoulder in front of my property at 2:14 in the afternoon. It left at 2:51, 37 minutes. That's a long time to sit in a car at the end of someone's driveway. Deputy Reyes had also pulled Gary's financial records as part of the investigation. What came back was a picture I hadn't known the full shape of. Online gambling accounts going back 22 months, losses spread across several platforms, the kind that add up quietly until they don't. Total somewhere above $38,000. That explained the pressure. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained it. Then there was the guardianship angle, which was the part that hit hardest. Gary had met twice with an attorney who specialized in elder guardianship proceedings. Not estate planning, not helping his father update a will. Guardianship, the legal process for arguing that a parent is no longer mentally capable of managing their own affairs, their own property, their own decisions. According to what the attorney later told investigators, Gary had described me as increasingly confused and possibly showing early cognitive decline. I'm 64. I rewired my own garage last spring. I have never once forgotten where I put anything that mattered. On top of that, Deputy Reyes connected Gary to a notary named Gene Pitts, one prior conviction for document fraud, suspended sentence 12 years ago. Gary had visited Pitts twice with photocopies of what appeared to be my property deed. Nothing had been filed, nothing had been signed yet. But the pieces were in place. The bump key marks on the old padlock, the camera footage, the financial records, the guardianship attorney, the fraudulent notary, together it was enough. Gary was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon. 3 charges: burglary, conspiracy to commit fraud, and preparation of a fraudulent instrument. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. That's what attorneys do. I want to say something here for anyone reading this who has aging parents or who is getting older themselves, because I think it's worth saying plainly. The warning signs were there. I just hadn't put them together. The repeated questions about selling the property, the sudden interest in whether I'd updated my legal documents, the questions about who had access to what. If someone in your life, even someone you love, especially someone you love, starts circling those topics more than once, pay attention. Guardianship fraud and property deed fraud targeting older homeowners who live alone is more common than most people know. It doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the booth right next to you at Thanksgiving. I'm not saying assume the worst about your family. I'm saying don't assume the best so automatically that you stop paying attention. 3 weeks after the arrest, I went back to that Walgreens on Route 9. I didn't know if Roy Cathcart would be there. I only knew his name and that cap with the pins on the brim. But I'd thought about him every day since November, and I needed, not answers exactly, something else. Closure isn't the right word either. I just needed to find him. He was at the pharmacy counter. He turned when he heard me come up behind him, and he looked at me with those same steady eyes and waited, like he'd been expecting me eventually. "I want to know how you knew," I said. He picked up his prescription bag and stepped to the side. I moved with him. 31 years as a detective, he said. You develop a sense for people. and I'd seen your son before. He let that sit for a second. About a month before I ran into you, I was having dinner with an old partner at a bar downtown. Your son was in the booth right behind us, talking loud enough that I couldn't tune it out. He looked at me evenly. He was talking about a property, a safe, a deed, and an old man who lived alone and went to appointments on Tuesday afternoons. I let that settle. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. What would I have told them? I overheard a man talking about real estate. He shook his head. I didn't have enough for that. But I had enough to warn you. You didn't know me, I said. Why bother? He looked at me with an expression I've thought about many times since. Not pity. Not sentiment. Something simpler and older than either of those things. You put your card on that counter without thinking twice. He said, "That's $147 I didn't have. Without that medication, I'd have been in serious trouble inside a week." He picked up his bag. Nobody's ever done that for me before. A stranger, just like that. He shrugged, just slightly. Seemed like the right thing was to return the favor. We shook hands in the vitamin aisle. I thanked him the best I could, which probably didn't come close to covering it. He nodded, straightened his cap, and walked out through the sliding doors. I haven't seen him since, but I think about him often. Brian drove up from Ohio the weekend after the arrest. We didn't talk about Gary much. There wasn't a lot left to say that hadn't already been said between us on the phone. We sat on the back porch in the evening with our coffee and watched the light go off the ridge. The shed was locked. The deed was in the safe. Helen's ring was in the safe. The $6,200 was in the safe. The new padlock is still on that door. The heavy-duty kind, hardened shackle, the one the hardware store man said you'd need an angle grinder to get through. I've got both keys on my key ring, right here in my pocket. Here's what I keep coming back to. I put my debit card on that pharmacy counter because it was the right thing to do in that moment. And for no other reason, $147, a stranger's blood thinner. A handshake. I didn't do it expecting anything back. But I've lived long enough to know that what you put out into the world doesn't disappear. It doesn't always come back fast, and it doesn't always come back in the shape you'd expect. Sometimes it comes back as a firm hand on your forearm and a quiet warning in a vitamin aisle on a Tuesday afternoon. Some people call that luck. I'm 64 years old. I've buried my father, my mother, and my wife. I've seen enough of how life works to know it isn't luck. Helen would have called it grace, the ordinary, everyday kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind you almost miss entirely if you're not paying attention. I'm paying attention now. That's the thing about small kindnesses. You never know which one is the one that saves you. Has a stranger ever said something to you that didn't make sense until it was almost too late? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.